So welcome to all participants to this live webinar, Collecting U.S. state and federal forms from your vendor. Are you compliant? This is sponsored by Tapalte. Before we begin, some housekeeping items to get started. This session is being recorded and we will send you a link to the recording within 3 days, but it will most likely be tomorrow. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. They will be saved for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. But if we don't get to all of your questions during the Q&A session, additional questions can be asked via email, and we'll give you those email addresses to send them to. Download the handouts. A PDF of the presentation is available, and that PDF does include the links so you can easily access the resources provided during the webinar. There is also a white paper on how to streamline supplier onboarding from Tipalti. Now, I am the first speaker, and my name is Deborah R. Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. As a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, I was responsible for maintaining 140,000 active global vendors across 7 different ERPs. Now I have a site dedicated to the vendor setup and maintenance process where I have some free and paid resources and tools, including a blog, podcast, on-demand webinars, and weekly training. So let's review the agenda. We're going to jump right into this webinar with federal forms you may need to collect from your vendor. Then we'll take a look at state forms that you may need to collect from your vendor. And then we'll hear from our sponsor, Tapalte, on how collecting these forms from your vendor can be easier than how you may be doing it today. And lastly, we'll wrap up with the Q&A session. But first, we do have our first poll question, and let me get that launched. Okay, so the first poll question, we'd like to know, what is your status related to a vendor self-registration portal? Do you have a live portal? Are you in the middle of a portal project where you're implementing it? Or do you have an RFP, or are you currently doing third-party provider demos? Or are you creating your business case and an ROI in order to get approval for your portal? Or E, you're just not thinking about it. And we ask this because, when you're collecting these forms, it can either be a manual process, so you're receiving it via email, or it can be an automated process if you have that vendor self-registration portal. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to go ahead and answer, and then we will go ahead and I'll show the results, and then we will go from there. Okay. So about 10 more seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. We have most have voted. And then let's share that. Okay, so it looks like we have the majority are not thinking about it, or you're in the process of creating a business case. Well, hopefully what we can talk about during this webinar, especially for the demo with Tipalti is how that vendor self-registration portal can help that process. We did have about 6% of you that have a live portal, and the same amount, 6%, are currently in a implementation, in some stage of implementation of a portal. So 6%, actually 12% either have a portal or on their way to having a vendor self-registration portal. So great poll. All right, so let me go ahead and that out of the way. Okay, so let's first now start talking about federal forms to collect from your vendor. And I do want to, as a reminder, I talked before about my background with 140,000 active vendors. I worked for a U.S. entity, and those vendors were in the U.S., they were in Canada, they were in APAC, EMEA, and LATAM, and each had their challenges, especially federal and state compliance for income reporting for those vendor payments. Now, for the forms that we're talking about today, I am not a tax professional. Rather, I am making you aware of forms that you may need to collect from your vendors if your organization is a U.S. entity. So be sure to take this information and confirm how it applies to your organization, because eligibility can be based on where your company or vendor is located, where the services are being performed, or where applicable, where the property is located. So let's start by looking at the federal level, the IRS forms. All right, so the Irs W-9 form is probably the most familiar form for most of us on this webinar. And most of you probably require it. And for that matter, most of your vendors know that they need to supply it to you. So you want to collect this form from all U.S. vendors. And while payments for goods are not reportable, I do recommend that the W-9 be collected from all vendors. One, to verify that the vendor is real via their legal name, tax ID combination match against IRS records, but also so that you can verify that tax ID, since in many accounting systems and ERPs, that is that unique ID from which the vendor records are maintained. Now, this form does not expire, but you should collect a new one from your vendors if any of the information changes, such as the legal name, the tax ID, or that W-9 address. Now, you do need to collect the most recent version, which is October 2018. I know they've had a lot of changes in the recent years, but you do need to collect the most recent version. And then you need to determine if your vendor is reportable based on tax classification and the type of payment. So for example, even if your vendor is a corporation and corporations are not reportable, if there are payments for things like legal services or medical expenses, those payments are reportable. Now, you do need to back up withhold if the vendor refuses to submit a W-9, or the legal name tax ID combination is not valid and that current rate is 24%. Now, one of the things to keep in mind on this form is that the most common errors in receiving this form is when the vendor will select the tax classification limited liability company, and that would be here. Now, if you receive a W-9 with this classification selected, but no letter indicating whether it is a C corporation, an S corporation, or a partnership, then you need to send it back, since a partnership is reportable and the other two are not. So you really need to know which one that is, and that's a very common error in receiving those W-9s. Lots of times that additional letter is not indicated. Now, I have added a link to the instructions for the latest version of this form, as well as a link to the Internal Revenue Service that governs this form. Okay. Now, if your vendor is not located in the U.S., you need to collect the IRS W-8 form. And on this webinar, we're only going to look at the two most common W-8 form types that vendor teams see for accounts payable payments. And the first one is the Irs Form W-8 BEN or BEN. This form should be collected from non-US or foreign vendors that are individuals. It really establishes that they are not a US person. Now, they are subject to U.S. tax from U.S. sources that consist of payments for interest, dividends, rents, royalties, premiums, annuities, services performed, as well as substitute payments or other fixed or determinable annual or periodic gains or profits. Now, unlike the W-9 form, this form does expire. It expires December 31st of the third year based on the signature date. And don't forget to track or monitor those expiration dates. I have included here a link to my site for a free IRS W-8 expiration date tracker. So if you don't have a way to track that now, make sure you download it, because you do need to track when those W-8s expire so that you can obtain an updated W-8. Now, for this W-8, and for vendors that submit the W-8 BEN, you need to determine whether that vendor is withholdable and or reportable. Now, for this, you may need a tax professional. When I was an AP senior manager, we had a designated tax professional. They handled, or that person handled the preparation of the annual tax filing. And so they would review each W-8 as we received them and identified if that vendor was withholdable and or reportable. And that was based on treaties in the vendor's country and other factors. We would then code the vendor record in the accounting system or ERP accordingly. Now, if withholdable, that current rate is 30%. Now, I do want to point out one thing, and that is the birth date on this form. And that birth date is only to be used in the purpose of reporting, for the vendor to report themselves as an account holder. So it may not be necessary for accounts payable payments. And if it's not absolutely necessary, I would recommend that you do not require or record the vendor's date of birth, since that is sensitive information. I also want to point out, not covered in this webinar, that the Form 8233 could be required under certain circumstances where foreign individuals are claiming tax treaty exemption. So be sure again to check with your tax professional. Now, I have added a link to the instructions for the latest version of this form, as well as to the IRS site that governs the form. Now, the next IRS W-8 form that we're going to cover is the W-8 BEN-E. It is the same information as with the W-8 BEN. However, you collect this form from non-US or foreign vendors that are entities. Now, they are subject again to US tax from US sources, the same as the individuals payables that includes services, rents, and royalties, what we typically see the most of in accounts payable. And again, this form expires December 31st of the third year based on the signature date. And again, don't forget to track. And again, here is the link. I added the link here to the IRS W-8 expiration tracker that I talked about on the last slide. Now, I do want to point out on this form that on line 8, if they are a partner in a partnership conducting a trade or business in the U.S., or they're claiming benefits under an income tax treaty, they will be required to file a U.S. tax return. And because of that, they must have a U.S. 10, meaning they need to have an employer identification number or EIN. So they should have an EIN to enter into or onto line 8. If they don't have one, they can apply for one using form SS-4. And again, check with your tax professional. And I have added a link to the instructions for this form, and again, a link to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service that governs this form. All right, so that is the IRS, the federal forms, the IRS W-8, BEN, W-8 BEN-E, and then the IRS W-9 that we went over first. And before we get to the state forms, we do have our next poll, because I really want to see if you guys are collecting, or if you guys are collecting any state forms right now. So let me go ahead and launch that. So you should see the poll on the screen. So yes or no, do you currently collect any state forms from your vendors? And again, I really want to see if you guys are currently collecting forms from any states, particularly any states that I may not have included in this webinar. That would be good information for perhaps a future webinar or maybe a blog or a podcast focusing on that particular state. So go ahead and vote. And 10 more seconds. Looks like we've got most folks have voted. I'll give 10 more seconds and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, it looks like we have most voted. I will go ahead and close the poll and we'll take a look at the results. Okay, so we have 14% are collecting state forms from your vendors. So if you can, for the folks that voted yes, either in the question section or in the chat, if you can just let me know what states you are collecting forms from your vendors for, that would be great. And the 86% that voted no, maybe you'll get some valuable information as we go through the 4 states that I've included in this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and let's hide that. And let's get back to the presentation, and we are starting now to go over the state forms. And as we start to look at the state forms, I do want to repeat, keep in mind that I am not a tax professional. Rather, I am making you aware of forms that you may need to collect from your vendors if your organization is a U.S. entity. So again, be sure to take this information, confirm how it applies to your organization, because eligibility can be based on where your company or your vendor is located. where the services are being performed, or where applicable, where the property is located. All right, so these are the 4 states that you may need to collect additional forms from your vendors: California, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, and South Carolina. And we're going to start with California, where the State of California Franchise Tax Board rules this requirements. Payments to non-residents for services performed in California, including rent, royalties, prizes, and other winnings, along with non-employee compensation, are all subject to withholding. Now, when setting up a new vendor that will provide services in the state, one of these 2 forms may need to be collected. Okay. Now, the first one is Form 587, the non-resident withholding allocation worksheet. So non-residents will complete this form to determine if withholding is required, and if required, the amount of California source income that is subject to withholding. Now, this form does not expire, but there is a new form that is out every year. So make sure your team is giving out that right version to vendors to complete. I have added a link to the instructions for the 2020 version of this form, as well as a link to the State of California Franchise Tax Board. Now, the next form is the Form 590, the Withholding Exemption Certificate. So if services are being performed, your company, your vendor, or property is located in California, and your vendor is a California resident, or they are a non-resident for which one of the exemption reasons apply based on entity type and or resident status. The exemption reasons do include if they're individuals but they're residents, if they're a corporation, if they're partnerships, and others noted on the form that's on the screen. Now the form does not expire, but again, there is a new form out every year, so make sure that your team is giving out the right version for the vendors to complete. And I have added a link to the instructions for the 2020 version of this form, as well as a link to the State of California Franchise Tax Board. So for your vendors, they will need to fill out, if your tax professional identifies these forms as being required, your vendor will fill out one of these 2 forms. Now, speaking of vendors, I did want to put this in here because I will say that I get a lot of questions, not just from the buyers or the clients, but I get a lot of questions from the vendor themselves, and particularly for these California forms, because for both of these forms, the Part 1 is the withholding agent information, and you really need to fill that out before you give it to vendors to complete. Save yourself some questions coming back to you once you submit or give that vendor to your form to the vendor to complete. Save yourself some questions coming back to you, because the vendors never know how to fill out these forms, and they don't know that they don't need to complete Part 1. That Part 1 is a withholding agent information, and so that information is yours to complete. And I'm going to back up really quick to go back to that, but you can see it has the withholding agent information here, and what what we used to do when we would give this to vendors, we would already pre-populate that information before we gave it to the vendors, so there would be no confusion on that. And I just wanted to include that because a lot of times vendors don't know how to fill out these forms correctly. And so if you fill out your portion before you give it to them, it makes it easier. All right, so the next state that we're going to talk about is Pennsylvania. Okay. Now, the Pennsylvania 1099 miscellaneous form or 1099 miscellaneous withholding exemption certificate, the Rev 1832, this requirement is relatively new. It's only been since January 1st of 2018. And generally, Pennsylvania source income is income derived from activity or property located in Pennsylvania. And that includes rental income, any work performed in Pennsylvania, like personal services or business income, income from intangible property, and then also gambling and lottery winnings. Now, what's interesting here is if you fail to withhold where required for payments over $5,000 at the 3.07% rate, the Department of Revenue can make your company liable for the amount that should have been withheld, and they will add both penalties and interest. And for that reason, you need to document the reason for not withholding by collecting that form, which really means you need, if you are liable for or required to collect that form in Pennsylvania, you really need to collect it from all vendors. Now, this form does not expire, and I do want to point out here that on the form, it indicates that being a resident of Pennsylvania or being a corporation or partnership is among the exemption reasons listed. So if they are a resident of Pennsylvania or their corporation or partnership, it's one of the exemption reasons. So again, make sure you give your vendors a form. They can select the applicable exemption reason if it applies to them, and then submit that to you. Now, I have added, again, a link to the instructions for this form, as well as to the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue that governs this form. So that is Pennsylvania. And let's go to our next state, which is Nebraska. So let's take a look at Nebraska. Now, according to the Nebraska Department of Revenue, non-resident individuals or entities who perform personal services in Nebraska are subject to withholding. And here's where it gets a little more complicated, because according to their information guide, you must determine who is performing the work to determine whether withholding is required. Now, here is some information from their guide. So payments made to non-residents performing personal services in Nebraska are subject to Nebraska withholding when the payer maintains an office or transacts business in Nebraska and the payments exceed $600, or whenever payments exceed $5,000. And it is similar to payments made to non-resident entities, except they add further criteria around whether a partner or shareholder is doing the work and how much of the company they own. So one other important point for this form, which is the the W-4 NA Nebraska tax withholding certificate for non-resident individuals. So one other important point for this form is that, and it really makes it unique, is that while the purpose of the form is to determine whether withholding is required, it also has sections to calculate the amount of withholding, but you have to wait for the invoices because the information that is used in the calculation, as well as other fields on the form, require the work to already have been performed. And that includes things like the date of service, the invoice information, which has the total payments, any business expenses included on the invoice, along with personal information of other professionals that were paid, in addition to the personal information of the partners, shareholders, members, and identifying that percent of allocation. The withholding rate can differ, so it is 4% if the payments total under $28,000, and if the payments are over $28,000, and that withholding rate increases to 6%. The form, however, does not expire, but again, it is one of those more complicated forms because it does require for one, the work to be done, and two, to identify who is performing the work as well. And again, I have included the link to the instructions for more information on the form, as well as the link to the Nebraska Department of Revenue. All right, and now for our last one, South Carolina. So if the Nebraska form was the most complicated form, I would say that South Carolina is the simplest form. Their I-312 non-resident taxpayer registration affidavit for income tax withholding, again, is probably the simplest form for your vendors to complete. Now, according to the South Carolina Department of Revenue, there are two vendor payment scenarios where withholding may be required for payments that we make in accounts payable, each with a different withholding rate and threshold. So the first one is the non-resident contractor withholding. These payments are payments to a non-resident taxpayer for services that are performed in the state. Now, the withholding rate is 2% if the total payments exceed $10,000. Payments to a non-resident taxpayer for royalty payments or rental payments for property in South Carolina is the second scenario. And for this one, the withholding rate is 7% for vendors that are not corporations and 5% for vendors that are corporations. Now, one way to avoid having to withhold from your vendors is if your vendor or if your eligible vendor is registered with the South Carolina Secretary of State or with their Department of Revenue. So that means that the vendor is then responsible for reporting and paying any applicable income tax to their state. And that is really the purpose of this form, for the vendor to disclose to you that they are registered with the state. Okay. And again, I do have a link for more information on this affidavit, and also on the South Carolina Department of Revenue. There is a link for more information. Okay. So key takeaways for both the federal and the state forms is to make sure that you determine the location of your company and of the vendor, determine where the services are being performed or where the property is located, and then check that applicable state website, check at the federal level as well, and then check with your tax professional. So in essence, gather that information and then review it with your tax professional to see if you have nexus in the state or if you need to collect forms that you're not currently collecting today. All right, so that was a lot. Hopefully you got some great information. We especially know that the IRS W-9 and the IRS W-8 forms can be a challenge for the vendors to complete accurately, especially the first time. So let's hear from Tipalti on how their supplier portal can be customized to automate the collection of both federal and state forms. And with that, I want to introduce to you our next speaker, Angie Rodriguez.
Hi, everybody. Angie Rodriguez here. I am attempting to take control.
Angie, I'll give you control after the next slide. Yeah, and then you can
Thank
go
you.
jump
I was like,
right
I don't
into
see the
your
button.
demo. You're
Thank
fine.
you. Hi, everybody. Angie Rodriguez here. I come to you from Tapalte, and I have recently joined this organization within the past 10 months, so I am a COVID hire, actually. I come from a long line of software vendors, and my experience has been in software solutions. Recently, in the past 5 years, I decided to become an accounts payable specialist, and I got very engaged in working with accounts payable. This has really opened the door to the need for the tax forms that we're going to show you today. And the whole idea is to talk to you about how Tipalti has eased the burden on both the suppliers as well as the customers of ours so that it's more easy for everybody to get things done. So with that said, I would like to go ahead and talk to you a little bit more about Tipalti in depth. The whole focus is that we can be a scalable solution. We are an efficient solution, whereas we take a lot of the workload off of you. And you'll see some of that just in the onboarding piece, but it extends throughout the whole automation of AP and the whole holistic solution, if you will. There are a lot of financial controls and things that are in place, like reminders to people to make sure that they update their W-8 form when it expires. And then the visibility that's available through our supplier onboarding will give a lot of insight to everybody, especially the vendors and what their statuses are and things. At that point, I wanted to also just mention that with Tipalti's onboarding experience, we're going to be utilizing KPMG's approved tax capabilities. So basically, they have helped us define these automated screens to capture an electronic tax form, if you will. So the collection of those forms are all digitized, and we can go beyond the US for those of you who have vendors that you would need to collect VAT IDs for. Along with just the W-8s, the W-9s, and the VATs, we will be able to process those and manage them so that they can always come back and update them as well. So on that note, we will be walking you through mainly the supplier onboarding portal of the solution. And as you can see, there are many, many features that Tipalti serves you as a holistic AP solution. And we will be able to surface that in other scenarios beyond this day. So I'm ready to go to my demonstration now.
It's coming over.
Thank you. All right, so this is the Tapalte onboarding screen. Pardon me, the logon screen. And the logon screen does allow us to use two-factor authentication. And this is something that you as a company would be logging into to invite your suppliers to the portal to help them make this onboarding process easy. So as I log into the Tipalti portal, what I wanted to mention once again is we're going to focus just in one area today, and that's about the payees and what the payees are doing. I'm going to bring up just a payee in the background so you can see what one might look like. And I'll bring up John Clark. So you can see the data in the background and that this is a payable payee. And the reason is because they have picked a payment method so that Tipalti can pay them. But more importantly, for today's conversation, they have a tax form. Whether it was submitted through Tipalti or submitted manually, we've been able to capture that data. So on that note, how would you go about managing supplier onboarding very easily within your organization? Well, you would click on this button called Add Payee, and you would have the opportunity to invite your suppliers to the portal to come out and fill out the information needed, and that is including that tax form. So we do take information from individuals or companies, and the only thing that changes is the company name comes and goes, of course, with that. Tipalti is only requiring 2 fields, which is a payee ID, and we can automatically fill that, as well as an email address so that we can send them an email so that they can be invited to the portal and fill out their tax forms. The rest of this page is filling out automatically because I've already typed this information in before, but they're not required fields, just the payee ID and the email ID. So the idea is we want to invite the supplier to the portal, and by clicking on Add, we would do that. And what are we doing on that note? We're sending an email. So we've collected their email. Now I've jumped from Tipalti's portal to your supplier's email inbox. This email starts at the bottom by inviting them to the supplier portal. And once they put in their security credentials, they'll be welcomed back into the portal to complete the information that I'm about to show you. But I wanted to mention there's also still that visibility and communication going on constantly, letting the vendors know what's going on. Maybe invoices are processing or payments are scheduled. Maybe they have actually changed some of their contact or payment information. Maybe they have to refill out their W-8 because it's expired. All of that's communicated once again through email. All of the emails are white labeled for your organization. So pretend for a moment that you are EverSky and your vendor is CloudCom. This is what the email would look like. The language in the center of the email is configurable to deliver a message that you want. And whoops, excuse me. And finally, this hyperlink right here in the center is the one that I wanted to focus on. So this hyperlink is a tokenized link. So that means it's secure and it's been sent to your vendor so that they can access the onboarding portal. Once again, eliminating you from any of that struggle. And knowing that security is working, you can tell that that hyperlink isn't really a hyperlink any longer. And it's because it's older than 7 days. So the idea here is, once again, sending a secure tokenized link for them to access the portal. When they click on it, they will go to the portal and it will look like this. Again, white labeled for your organization. And they have 3 simple things to complete: the address, the payment method, and the tax forms. So as you can see on this first page, the address is pretty simple. And any information that you put in during that last page right here would populate here. So knowing that, you can help your vendors out a little bit by filling out all the fields, even though you know only 2 were required fields. So name and address is very important for Tipalti because every time we make a payment to someone, we do OFAC and other screenings. However, for this purpose today, it's important because it's going to drive the type of tax forms that they will be offered and the type of payment methods that they'll be offered as well. So as I continue to the next page, you can see there are those payment methods that we have been talking about, and I will reserve that for a future demo with any of you that are interested in the complete end-to-end holistic solution of Tipalti. And I wanted to focus here on the third and final page of the onboarding process, and that's tax forms. So Tipalti for this vendor has offered out the W-8 Payee, the W-8, and the W-9, as well as a couple of other forms that are available for downloading, completion, and re-uploading. These are the federal forms that I want to discuss at this point, and it's the opportunity for someone to come out and fill them out in a digital fashion. So as I click on the W-9, I could complete it, but what if I didn't know which type of tax form I really needed to fill out? I wanted to show you that we have a tiny wizard here, and this little wizard will ask us 5 simple questions and then tell us what type of form to fill out. So perhaps I want to fill out a W-8 form, maybe, I don't know. So let's go through the wizard. If I say no to all of these questions, it will come back and tell me, oh, you don't need a W-8, you need a W-8 Payee. So then it would allow us to go and fill out the W-8 Payee. So I just wanted to show you that if folks don't know what to do, they can go through the wizard. If they know what to do, like fill out a W-9, they can go ahead and begin to complete the form. Once again, KPMG has certified these and made sure that they are IRS compliant forms, and they've made them simple. They did that by pulling off the required fields from those forms. So when I'm looking at this W-9, I'll fill out my individual company or company name. I will choose the type of company that I am. I will also give an address for this company. Over here, we will supply the Social Security or the EIN of the organization, and Tipalti will do the TINS validation in the background for you, so you wouldn't have to worry about that before they sign digitally at the bottom and they're complete with the process. So it's a super simple form, and I'm pretty sure that, as you guys have seen in this presentation and may already know, the W-8 Payee are much more complex forms. Completing those forms, which are typically 15 pages if you printed it out, can be done digitally in 5 simple sections. So Tipalti has again reduced this, along with our friends KPMG, to a form that is much more consumable. So we will fill out the part 1 of the W-8 Payee, along with the beneficial earner information, the claim of treaty benefits, review that before we certify and sign it digitally here. So similar to the W-9, it's just a simple form to fill out and you walk through the process. I wanted to go ahead and take you back to this page because there's a step that can be added here, and that would be a 5th step where you could upload state tax documents. So if you're in one of those 4 states or doing business in one of those 4 states that Deborah just mentioned, we would change this number 4 to be a document, and then step 5 would be done. And so in the document phase, you would just have the standard upload a document, and we would provide you the opportunity to upload your state tax forms and house them in Tipalti. So I wanted to jump back over to Tipalti real quick and show you where those forms might be housed. They would live here in the documents area. And so whatever type of documents that they've uploaded, they would upload them and they would come here and be available if you need to set the system up so that you need to approve it. It could be in a state like you see here, pending approval. And these items over here on the burger menu will give you the option to do the approvals. So it's up to you if you want the approvals or if you don't want the approvals, but know that those are available. Another thing that I wanted to emphasize about Tipalti's tax and tax reporting is that we will have a 1099 preparation and a 1042S prep report. And those are available for payments made out of Tipalti. So if you're making your payments out of Tipalti, we'll be able to give you a report listing each of the vendors that are W-9 participants, summarizing by month. Now, these are just preparation reports. So those preparation reports give you that detail that you can transfer them over to the actual W-9. And Tipalti also has business partners like Sovos that we can introduce you to in order to automate that process of taking the data from the W-9 or the W-1099 prep report to the actual form. So those are the opportunities that Tipalti will provide your organization for ongoing automation of tax forms. Deborah, I can throw it back to you now.
All right, get myself unmuted. All right, thank you, Angie. And might I say that I, one, love the fact that if the vendor doesn't know which form they need to complete, they can go through that questionnaire. And 2, the interactive forms, especially the W-8, because one thing I mean, I mentioned before that vendors have some can find it difficult to complete some of these forms, but it can also be difficult for the vendor team receiving the forms to know if they're filled out correctly. So having those interactive forms makes it easier for both the vendors and the vendor team. So that was great. All right, so let's see. I'm going to go ahead and share. Let's take that back. Okay. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go into our third poll question, which I'm going to go ahead and launch our third and last. So let me go ahead and launch that. And that is, you should see it on your screen. Very simple, yes or no. Would you like to schedule a demo of Tipalti's top-rated payables automated solution? So again, go ahead and select yes or no, and someone from Tipalti will certainly be in touch. And I'll give you a couple more 10 more seconds to go ahead and vote. And then we will move to our next slide. All right, so it looks like we have the most have voted, and it looks like we have, let's share. So we do have 6% that indicated yes. And for those that indicated no, just in case you change your mind, especially as you take this information back to your tax professionals and they identify whether or not you actually need to collect vendor forms from any of these states, you can use the link on the Request a Demo Today button here to reach directly out to Tipalti and request a demo and click that link to get started. Okay. And then I did want to include how to connect with me, especially on YouTube, where I have a Vendor Master File Tip of the Week. So be sure to check that out and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and subscribe to get my weekly email so you can be kept up on all things vendor maintenance. All right, so we are at the Q&A section of the or portion of the webinar. We've got a few minutes left to go through our questions that we've received. If we do not get to all of your questions, you can feel free to reach out to me directly at Deborah at deborah@deborah.richardson.com. Or if you have a question for Tipalti, feel free to reach out to them at contact@tipalti.com. All right, so the first question that I see is, can we use an older version of the W-9 if the legal name and tax ID matches the IRS? So I'll take this one. And again, if you had Tipalti's solution, you wouldn't have to worry about that because the W-9 is interactive and it'll always be the latest version. But we know that when you're collecting that W-9 manually, and check with your tax professional, but we know that vendors will save those W-9s like forever. And my recommendation is that you require the most current version, as that is what the IRS requires to maintain due diligence in case there's an audit. Certain versions of the form also includes things like additional certifications like for FATCA. And I don't remember which version of the form added like an additional certification that the vendor needed to sign off on. But so that you need to make sure that you're using the latest version for those types of reasons. And again, I know it's a lot to keep up with. I did at one point for one of my blogs, I counted in the 2000s, there were 11 or 12 revisions, with the latest one being October 2018. And again, those vendors will save those versions of the form so they can just hurry up and whoever your contact is at the vendor may save it and just submit it just to check that, check that box. But if they have a version of the form, especially one that doesn't include like the certification for FACA or some other information that should be on the latest form that the IRS requires, you definitely need to push back and get the correct version of the form. All right, so I hope that answered your question in full. Let's take another one. The next question is, I have international partners to pay, and we struggle to collect tax information. How are W-8 forms handled? And actually, we've got a couple of questions out there about the W-8. So, Angie, can you take this one about how the W-8s are handled within the portal?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was showing you, similar to the W-9, the W-8 can be selected and completed. So many companies are struggling with W-8 form collection, and FATCA regulations make this problem even more difficult as the documentation required for partners becomes more extensive. Tipalti does make the W-8 a self-service process for the payees. There's a wizard that's available in multiple languages that guides the payees through the right tax form to fill out, and that's how they begin. From there, they have a greatly simplified form that validates and guides the payee through the tax form, vetting all the data, checking it against multiple rules in the background, like 3,000 as an example, rules that we're vetting the data against. So this greatly reduces the amount of time typical companies take troubleshooting and correcting and having errors. So that's what Tipalti can provide.
Yeah, and I didn't think about it, but the multiple languages can be key because some of the foreign vendors may not, have English as their first language, and so being able to go through that wizard in their local language, I think that is key because we did have when I was a practitioner, we did have some vendors reach out to us, and they had that problem with understanding the instructions or how to fill it out because it wasn't in their local language. So I think that can be key.
Agreed.
Yeah. So this next one, we typically get, or I typically get a lot of my webinars because I talk about fraud a lot. Angie, this one's for you. How does Tipalti help reduce fraud risk?
That's a great question, Deborah. Um, there are several mechanisms to help mitigate fraud risks. Tipalti has enterprise-grade security and two-factor authentication for payees and payers. We segregate roles by using permissions to drive who can access what information in Tipalti. We comply with all the OFAC and AML regulations to make sure you don't pay people that the government doesn't want you to be paying. On top of that, we have the risk management module that lets you flag and that lets us flag and prevent attempts for fraud being made. And companies often participate in our risk management network, which can help prevent fraud across the entire customer base.
Yeah, and I really like the OFAC piece. And I will say I am a big advocate for, cleaning your vendor master file and doing validations. And for OFAC, for U.S. entities, you're really not supposed to pay those vendors if they're on any watch list. And the problem is that, you do all those validations when you onboard the vendor, but you do need to make sure that you continue to do those validations in case they subsequently appear on the list. And so it looks like Tipalti has that covered as well. Okay. All right, so we've got a couple minutes left. Probably less to answer a question. I do want to pick out within the questions. I did get an additional state. So I had asked, I think it was the second poll, whether or not any attendees were were filing or collecting forms from the vendors from states, and if there were any different than the four I identified, to go ahead and put that in the questions, and someone did, and it was New Jersey, and it looks like they are collecting. The form is called ST8. So look for that. I'll definitely do some research on that state, and I may have a blog or a podcast in the future. So in addition to the four states that I talked about today, if any of the attendees, if you think you have nexus or you have vendors or properties that are performing, vendors performing services in New Jersey, or properties that are located in New Jersey, you may want to follow me or go ahead and do some research on your own for New Jersey. Okay, so if you have any further questions, again, please feel free to contact me at deborah@deborahrichardson.com. If you have questions for Tipalti on their supplier management solution, please send an email to contact@tipalti.com. Any questions that are in the question section that we didn't get to, expect a direct email. This webinar is now concluded.